Today, we are joined by my good friend, Frank Kilcommins, over in Ireland, who works for Smartbear, to talk about a new specification it is out of the OpenAPI team, right? It's the
It
same, the
is,
same
yeah.
group that created the famous OpenAPI and works at Smartbear, who invented Swagger and which became OpenAPI, to talk about a new specification that's pretty exciting, actually. So before we get into it, Frank, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and how you got here. I know you've had an awesome career in the API space, so share it with the audience.
Yeah, cool. Well, firstly, thanks, Josh. Delighted to be here chatting with you. Yeah, so my title at SmartBear is a nice fancy one, like we all have, which is Principal API Technical Evangelist. And that basically means I'm the wearer of many hats. So I support the product and engineering teams with our kind of API governance standards internally, as well as kind of interacting with the broader community and trying to help folks get the most out of SmartBear API tooling, as well as making sure that we're actually moving in the right direction with how the industry is evolving. So part of that, naturally, given the history of Swagger and SmartBear and things like the OpenAPI initiative, means that I spend a good portion of my time also helping the folks over at the OpenAPI initiative. And that led me to kind of play one of the leading contributor roles on the creation of this new specification. So how it kind of started is within the OpenAPI initiative, we started to create special interest groups because we realized that the community had lots of specific needs that were more industry or topic focused that weren't necessarily related to the specification itself. So, the technical steering committee over there is quite small, quite limited capacity. So we set up these different working groups effectively to focus on different and topics of interest to help drive and support the API community. And one of them was around workflows. And that's where it all started, probably about 18 months ago, and culminated in us launching a new specification 2 weeks ago, called the Arazzo specification, which is a tapestry for describing deterministic API workflows, which is topical given all of the AI hype that's around the API space now as well.
Okay, so we got to explore that a little bit. I'm excited about the AI segue there. What is an API workflow? Like, what does that mean?
Well, really, when we think about it, or when, at least from a working group perspective with the Arazzo group, when we say a workflow, it really is just a series of API calls, which, when woven together, help us achieve a specific outcome. So it's like a higher level of abstraction than a specific API or set of operations within an API. It can actually span multiple APIs as well to really help a consuming developer achieve their job to be done.
Interesting. So when I think about OpenAPI, which we're huge fans of at Zuplo, it's actually powers our gateway, as you know. Um, OpenAPI lists a bunch of operations, but it kind of lists them very independently. Like you'd have to add documentation to say that this call is related to this call in this way, and maybe you need to call things in this order. That would be written in a non-machine readable way if we ignore LLMs. It would be written in a way that sort of, you'd have to put it into plain text or in markdown inside the description, right? What it sounds like you're saying this is a way of documenting that order, that sequencing of API calls and how they relate together in a more structured specification format. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. It really is for providing deterministic recipes for the use of APIs. So, think about situations where I might be onboarding to your API, not the Zuplo APIs, of course, they're very nice and succinct. But you can imagine the GitHub API, it's really, really large. It crashes so many different types of renderers out there. But if I'm trying to achieve a specific use case, there's nothing really that helps me make sense of that unwieldy or very, very large API. So it can be quite a cognitive load as a developer to really try and understand and process the documents and do trial and error type of interaction. In the other situation, if you're very modular with how you create and craft your APIs, then you have a problem when a business flow spans multiple API documents. Then
Mm,
OpenAPI itself doesn't give you any inherent
mm,
mechanism to be able to chain those things together when they leave the boundary of a single API document.
Got it. So like a bank might have an accounts API that's in one OpenAPI doc, and then it might have a transactions API in a different OpenAPI doc, but actually they might actually be part of a workflow, right? I might need to like
Correct.
update the account and then send the account ID to the create a transaction. And there's not an easy way of even doing that in plain text in those OpenAPI docs because they're completely distinct documents, right?
Exactly, yeah. And you touched on one of the other big problems that's out there as well when you talk about the non-machine readable format. So, we've all been there. We've all been kind of involved in APIs for quite some time. And if you're onboarding developers, yes, you give them access to your Open API description or your whatever form of technical reference documentation you have. But then ultimately, you will probably supplement that with additional, more human palatable documentation. So be that
Mm,
static HTML that's in a developer portal, be that Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, PDFs, different flow diagrams that you're crafting. And as soon as you craft those more human centric formats of documentation, they have this um, not so nice habit of becoming stale very, very
mm,
quickly.
mm. Okay, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. You mentioned you mentioned something about AI. How is this interesting in an AI world?
Well, it was kind of the elephant in the room as we were working towards creating a new independent specification. There was folks from different AI tooling vendors and general, researchers that have skin in the game from an AI perspective, to put it bluntly. And they were kind of asking us, are we considering AI when it comes to being able to execute and chain API calls together? And ultimately, the Arazzo specification gives that ability because it is machine readable, of course. It's something that can be very deterministically followed by machines. And one of the challenges we have in the kind of Gen AI side of AI is the likelihood of certain hallucinations happening, or you will ask the model to consume APIs and to do these things, and it will do it 80% well or
Mm,
90% well, but you don't have a very high level of confidence that it will do it 100% accurately, and definitely that it will do it 100% accurately every time. And if you can imagine, if you're dealing with API sequences or flows that are critically important. Like, think if this is healthcare, or you're maybe dealing with people's private data, their financial data, financial transactions, etc. You need to make sure that if you're handing off that responsibility to an AI agent to perform that on your behalf, that it will work first time right and every time right.
mm,
Um, and that's one of the things that we see tremendous potential for. And
mm.
it's also kind of negating or nipping in the bud a bit of an anti-pattern that I see happening right now, or over the last 18 months, which I'm coining as backend for LLM. But what's happening is we're seeing a lot of semantic stuffing into API responses and API designs, just so that they will work with a particular LLM model. But
Give
that's
it
not
give
very
him
interoperable.
give me an example of that. Like what does this stuffing look like? Like what's a
You will just inject additional properties or headers into your response and to add additional context, so that the LLM kind of can grok what's actually there and then knows how to maybe move on to the next step. So it's really
oh,
just
so
to
like
try and
leaving
enrich the context.
got it. So like leaving breadcrumbs almost as you follow the trail of the API call, the response is going to go, and next you might want to create a
Exactly.
transaction or
Ex-
something.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, and so
And
when
there's certain extensions, like OpenAI have some extensions and some let's say examples and how they want folks to do that, but that's not going to be the same for another AI provider. And ultimately, if you're building APIs and you want to make them available to all of the models that are out there, it would be nicer and better to be able to do so in an interoperable way.
right, right, that makes sense. And so just to recap then, when I think about ChatGPT from OpenAI, how confusing is the OpenAI, OpenAPI? What a mouthful this is.
It is, yeah.
The ChatGPT world, they did plugins. I think they've deprecated those now, but they were the way a plugin learned about an API was through learned about an API was through an OpenAPI document. So it's actually
Correct.
very conversant. I use ChatGPT to generate OpenAPI docs for me all the time, actually, for demonstrations. And so there's definitely some benefit to the fact that this is a structured, even though, LLMs are great at kind of reading text, but being forced to structure your API in a more formal manner increases the chance that the LLM is going to understand exactly how to use it. And you're saying what Arazzo does now is add that for the workflow part as well. So OpenAPI covers the breakdown and the details and like the schema, and then Arazzo is kind of layering on top of that to say these are how these things can work together in the sequencing and the ordering, and that can also be understood by LLMs in a more accurate way. Is that fair?
Exactly, yeah, and we're hopeful that let's say the mechanism of adding an open API to a custom GPT that's supported right now will evolve, and you'll be able to actually add an Arazzo document, which will give you a much broader scope of what that GPT can do. You're not limited to just a single open API description.
Super cool. Super cool. Awesome. Well,
There's
I
a
mean,
few other
maybe.
ones as well, maybe not as sexy or interesting, but one that's actually I like quite well is really trying to improve the ecosystem around code generation and SDKs. And
Mm,
so again, if you think about code generation off an open API description, then you're going to get code that's generated for the full surface area of that particular document, unless your tooling gives an ability for folks to select certain operations. But again, there is no real inherent linking or sequencing between those things.
mm,
Whereas if you generate code for a specific Arazzo document, which ultimately is a use case, it's the functional use case that you want to achieve, then that SDK is really going to keep the developer who's interacting with that on pieced, in flow, focusing on achieving that use case and getting it integrated into their application. They're not going to be distracted by all of the other operations that are potentially in the SDK.
does that mean that the SDK might be generated slightly differently now to better support these workflows? Is that sort of one of the use cases of Arazzo, is in SDK generation?
It is, yeah, and there are a few vendors who are already kind of playing around and looking at it from that perspective, which I think is very cool. There's also regulatory bodies who are looking at it, so there's different open banking groups who are looking at uh, utilizing Arazzo to benchmark certain regulatory requirements. So if you think about open banking, for example, you can say, okay, if you're a bank and you're providing X amount of APIs to the market, we want to also ensure that you are supporting these use cases that will allow the fintechs to achieve what they are hoping to get from you. And again, you can apply this systematically across all of the banks to determine if they are truly providing what they're regulatory required to provide. That's one area. The OpenID Foundation are also looking at it to help document complex financial grade APIs, so FAPI APIs, and being able to
Mm,
document things like push authorization requests, etc., which are quite hard to do relying solely on OpenAPI.
okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting. I think it's time to see this thing. How would you start to explain it to people? Like
Well,
what it looks like, I mean, we've talked about the sort of some of the use cases and why it exists, but let's make it real. I want to see something. Show me some structure.
okay, I will show you the structure. So, for folks out there who are familiar with OpenAPI and Async API, we have a similar type of picture.
There we go.
So it is a specification on a page, for want of a better way of describing it. So at the top, you have some metadata. So this is your info object, similarly to what you would have in OpenAPI. So
Hmm.
um, you're listing the specific version of this document itself. So if we were to look at that very, very briefly, you have a title, you have a summary, you have a description, and then you have the version of this particular document that you're crafting. I'm not going to go through all of this now, but I think what's slightly interesting to set some of the differences from the current versions of OpenAPI, but a little bit of a peek into the future, being aligned with the thinking around the next version of OpenAPI, which hopefully will come in the not too distant future. We have the concept of source descriptions. So these are a little bit like namespaces.
Mm.
So it's like me defining the scope um, from which I can then craft these workflows. So if I want to describe a workflow across 4 APIs, I need to make sure that I'm referencing these APIs as part of the source descriptions. So in this particular example, I'm just pulling in 2 APIs, giving the name, I'm giving the URL to where that OpenAPI description is, and I'm setting the type. So right now we support referencing open APIs as well as other Arazzo documents. So you can actually chain workflows together as well and utilize them in different ways.
Awesome. Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah.
And then beyond that, you have the core of the workflows. So that just takes different inputs, um, takes parameters. So this is really how you will map into the different operations. And then it has things that you can optionally do when a step is successful, or things that you can optionally do if a step is not successful. So you can imagine a situation where you get a 401 back from an API call, and you can actually inspect that token. You determine it's no longer valid. You can reach out to another workflow to say, hey, refresh my token. When
Mm.
that comes back, you can retry the current step again. So you have quite sophisticated branching and retry capabilities that you can do to give you the best possible chance of allowing a machine to execute this workflow successfully on your behalf.
That's cool. So if you get a 401 unauthorized because the token expired, you could literally trigger like an OAuth token refresh
Exactly.
workflow that could be documented somewhere. Very nice. With
Right.
and with retry counts as well. What's the what's inputs and parameters? What is an input and a parameter, and what's the difference between them?
So inputs are what you will pass from the calling context. So let's say your software is invoking an Arazzo workflow. That will be where you provide out of band inputs. So in a very crude example, let's say you wanted to provide a username and password into the workflow. That would allow you to pass it in because the workflow can't determine that up front, and you hope it's not hard coded into the Arazzo document itself.
Mm.
So you just pass these inputs in. Parameters are all around how you map into a particular API operation. So if you want to map query parameters, headers, um, cookies, etc., it gives you a very explicit um, semantic way of being able to reference those things.
Got it. Okay, makes sense. Makes sense. And then, so it looks like the workflow. I guess the star means you can have multiple workflows in a single document, right?
Yes, you can indeed. So let me just quickly run through. So this is the inputs. So as we said, it's just a JSON schema to describe what your inputs are. You then can pass those in however you want to pass them in. Um, we then have the steps itself. So you can have multiple steps within a workflow, and you can have multiple workflows within a single Arazzo document. Every step has an ID, it has a description, it has some way of referencing an operation in an API if it's calling an API. Um, Unfortunately, Operation ID is not a required property in OpenAPI. But if it is there, you can use the Operation ID. And here you can see with the pets API dot get pets, that's me using the namespace of the source description that we would have kind of set up at the start. If
Got
you
it.
don't have an operation ID, then there's an operation path. So you can use JSON pointer syntax to reference into a particular place or location within the API itself. And then you have something called success criteria. So this is determining what are the conditions to tell whatever is processing this that this step is particularly, or sorry, is successful. So in this example, if the status code of the API is 200, and if I can inspect the body and determine that there is a pets array there and it contains at least one value, then I'm calling that this step is successful.
Okay, so the context is saying that is the context belongs to that condition. And so it's
Yes,
saying the condition here is looking at the response body. And then there's some
correct.
kind of new programming language I'm looking at here. What is the syntax
This
that you're
is
using for that?
this is the latest and greatest version of JSON Path. So some of the new functions that are in the new RFC that's been published. And if you don't
Interesting.
support that, you can downgrade in line to an older version of JSON Path as well. You would just need to explicitly say that within the document.
Oh, got it. Okay, so this new JSON path specification can do sort of simple computation to do evaluation and transformations and things like that, or
It has a certain amount of functions that are there. Yeah.
cool, cool, interesting, awesome, love it, cool.
So let me see if there's anything else interesting in here. I think this is pretty interesting. So this was the example of the retry step that you talked about. So exactly as you predicted, Josh, there is a retry limit and a retry after. So in this particular situation, the criteria here is telling whatever is processing it um, to say execute this retry if the criteria holds true. So if we did get a 503 service unavailable, then let's attempt to retry the current step
Mm,
5 times and exhaust after 5 times. There's other types of retry of failure action objects as well. There is an end, so it does what it says in the 10. If the condition that's specified holds true, you just give up and you stop. There's also a go to, which is a one-way temporary transfer to another label that's described somewhere else within the Arazzo document itself. And in the particular retry type, you can enrich it even further. So you can reach out to another workflow. So you could specify a workflow ID, or you could specify a step ID. So that would say the condition holds true. So the example that we talked about a little bit earlier, let's imagine the condition was status code 401. Um, if that was the case, we could reach out to another workflow ID that was actually the refresh token workflow. And once that is executed, then we come back to the current context and we retry. And
got it,
hopefully then we get a 200 or at least a successful series response code.
got it. Okay, that makes sense. Actually, if you just go back 1 second,
The success
yeah, there we
criteria.
go. So on this one where we saw the JSON path, cool stuff. So what would go in on success? Like the name of another workflow?
On success is just an optional thing to define. So if you don't define any on success properties, so on success is an array of success actions.
Got it.
If you don't define any of those, the steps just execute sequentially.
So
Um,
there's an array of steps. This is step ID, search pets. There might be another one in order, which is get pet or get, put pet or whatever,
or
and that will
whatever the
just
case
happen
may
next
be.
if it's successful. If there's some sort of failure indication
If
because the
there's some
success
sort of
criteria
failure
weren't met.
indication, it will execute whatever is defined within the on failure. If nothing is defined in on failure, it stops after
Got
it
it.
has failed. So just to give you a little flavor of the on success situations. So in this particular example, there's two types of success actions. So one is go to, so in this particular example, I'm determining that I have everything I need. So maybe I can skip some sequential steps and I can move already on to the join waiting list step in this particular example. I don't have to do some other processing that I've already determined I have everything I need. And the other type is end. So again, if certain conditions hold true, then you could just end. Another thing that you might imagine is if you wanted to do some additional um, logging or notifications upon the success of particular steps, then you could just utilize the on success situation for that if you wanted to.
Very, very cool. Very interesting. I mean, you have really the very, what feels like, I don't know if it's fair to say the beginnings or something further along than of a full sort of workflow language here. I mean, I used to work on Windows Workflow Foundation at Microsoft and BizTalk Server and Logic Apps, which are these ETL workflow engines. It reminds me a lot of what the JSON structure, or it probably wasn't JSON actually, but the XML structure that underlied the sort of the orchestration engine of these workflows. Is that a comment you get a lot? Is that like something that you see that as an ambition for the project?
It's one of those ones we weren't intentionally trying to create a programming language.
Mm,
We are fairly confident that in its current state it is Turing complete. We haven't run a test on it, but it does support branching, for example, as you can see with the on failure and on success.
mm-hmm.
And there's a rudimentary form of looping in there with a combination of and success criteria and the on success type of handling. And there are some specific asks to add a first class looping mechanism there, coming from coming from quite a few, but the main ones who are very interested in it are the Open Travel Alliance. And so they're very interested in crafting workflows for all of the different players in that type of industry, so that there can be some continuity with regards to how the different providers, be it airlines, trains, hotel reservations, car bookings, dinner reservations, etc., can start advertising the different use cases. And they have real needs for having kind of a first class looping type of situation where
Mm.
you might want to search for flights, but then you might want to check other things for each flight before you return it back to the context, because there might be other conditions, be it price or be it um, baggage allowance, etc., that would rule it out for different reasons, and you wouldn't be able to determine that based on the upfront call. You would have to iterate over all of the
Got it. Got
responses.
it. Or like a silly example I'm thinking of. What if there's an open API out there that has a delete only by ID, and you want to delete a tranche of things, right? Then you could do a get query and then do a loop of deletes until there are no results in the get query, right? Would be like a simple example of how a loop might appear in a process workflow here.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. How would you recommend people get started like building this? Like, is there tooling for it? What's the recommended way to like? How should I write my first Arazzo doc?
So there's lots of vendors who are, well, when I say lots, I'm aware of at least 10 vendors who are actively working on tooling for
Okay.
this, covering different aspects of the space. Some are SDK related, some are AI related, some are testing related. So you can also imagine the usefulness of Arazzo from a testing perspective. So you want to describe that this workflow is possible across these APIs, and you want to be able to test and ensure that that's going to happen. So the assertability of that is something that's very interesting. And then if any underlying API changes throughout its life cycle, then we still want to ensure that the use case that we're promising to our customers or whomever is still working, is still achievable. So there are folks working on that, and then
Cool.
indeed there's folks working on the crafting of documents and the rendering of these documents. There's nothing production ready yet. So as I said, the specification went live on the 29th of May, as we can see here on the screen. And it's great getting the specification out there, that's step one, but a specification is only useful when it actually comes with lots of vendors implementing support into their tooling. And then that's what brings it in front of everyone who is practitioners of APIs, if we want to describe people who are producing APIs like that. So right now, there's no active tool there, but I do
Mm,
have a little GPT that I put together myself just
of
to kind of
course.
whet the appetite or give folks
Isn't this
some
isn't this how the
indications
tools are
as
all going to
to,
look? Isn't this the future of tooling? Like a chat window?
well,
Isn't haven't you just built it?
it's like Back to the Future, we just, it's a little bit like how I always thought I would be interacting with computers would be through voice and through natural language. So things are moving that way indeed. So this little simple GPT, it's just trained on the specification. So if we were, if you want to ask a question, you can, but that's not necessarily too interesting. So I
Wait, sorry.
have,
When you say ask a question, can I like ask it the questions I've asked you? Did we even need to have this interview, Frank? Could I just start
maybe
a chat
not.
with your chat
Maybe the
GPT?
GPT could have replaced me. Yeah.
You said it first.
um,
Well, show us how
Perhaps.
you'd use it for something like you say, like more productive, like to help you with the tooling.
Yeah. So let me paste in kind of a real world situation here. So I have two OpenAPI descriptions located at these URLs. So these
Hmm.
are publicly accessible and no authentication required to get access to the documentation. And what I'm asking this GPT to do is to process the documents and then generate an Arazzo document for a use case of adopting a pet matching specific criteria. and it should be able to do that based on endpoints it can locate within those two APIs. And the workflow that I'm looking for adopting a pet matching certain criteria should have these steps in it. So it should be able to search for a pet, initiate an adoption request, confirm adoption by updating the status, and then at the end verify that the pet indeed has been adopted and is no longer showing as available in
Cool.
the pet listing. And then there's just some additional notes here to make sure that ChatGPT actually tries its best. So send this off. Let's see what happens. So it's thinking, and as we see, it thinks it doesn't have access, but then it realizes that it does have access to the internet again, and it goes through the process of crafting the Arazzo document. And to be honest, my opinion is that this is where a lot of it's the way a lot of things will go. So probably the days of everyone crafting raw YAML are nearing an end.
Yeah.
And it will be a much more either drag and drop type of low code, no code human experience, or a natural language experience. And then from there, the underlying structured YAML will be crafted. But, humans won't really have to care too much about that, but that's the determinism that we will need to make sure that the software that we build will actually work. So this is what it does. It does a pretty decent job at creating the document. I'm sure if I went through this, there would be a couple of errors in there, but that is the nature of generative AI. But it helps me do, or it negates the need for me to do all of the heavy lifting, and I think that's the main benefit for it. How I've trained this GPT is I've asked it also to give me some outputs and some syntax that I can use to generate more human friendly graphics with regards to what's happening within the workflow. So it does it for PlantUML and it does it for Mermaid. And what I also have trained the GPT on is then to also generate some client code, but we don't need to get into that right now. But ultimately, the finished article, if I wired this up from a CI/CD perspective, where I would be leveraging OpenAI APIs or interacting with the GPT behind the scenes from an automation perspective, getting the information back, is that when it comes to the developer portal, obviously within the developer portal, I'll have my APIs. So I have my pets API, I have my adoptions API, but I've been able to kind of create a walkthrough with how I can ingest this workflow as a human developer. So I get a nice little table, and of course, there's much nicer ways to render this. This is my very crude setup, but quite quickly I can grok, okay, within this step, I need to call this operation. Here are the parameters I need. If 200 is returned, means it's successful. And the output I'm most interested in from the response is the available pets. Here's the graphical representations of the diagrams, just different flavors, PlantUML and Mermaid. You can imagine, you can craft whatever you want to craft. And interestingly, then we also have the client code that's generated from the Arazzo document. So if I was to just generate client code from those two APIs, I would get boilerplate code covering the full surface area of those APIs and no inherent linking between the different operations. Where now I have a client that is going to execute that specific workflow for me.
So just to understand this actually, so you're saying traditionally with SDK generation, with the OpenAPI, I would generate 2 discrete methods or 6 discrete methods. I'd have to do all of this work of like writing retries and catching a 501 a 503 exception, and this could now also be generated because of this workflow layer above those open APIs. And now I can go to having a single operation on my SDK that is, whatever's manifested by the workflow as a single operation with all the necessary inputs, and it just takes care of all of that orchestration for me.
Correct. Indeed. Cool. Yeah. So that's just a very quick example to kind of, hopefully give people ideas as to how they can come up with cool use cases and cool tools to improve the experience around APIs. And I think one of the things I'm most excited about is the improvements that it can bring to the consumer side of the API fence. So if you think about elevating that developer experience, making sure that people can stay focused on the goal that they have, which is ingesting some capability into their application, really there's the potential there to reduce the mean time to integration and keep them focused and not distracted by very, very large, unfriendly, unwieldy documentation that's out there in probably a higher ratio than we would like.
Very, very cool. Very cool. Actually, if you can just let me share my screen a second, there's something I want to run through with you. If you, I think you'll have to stop
Of
sharing yours.
course.
So this is a thing we call the OpenAPI Wheel of Fortune when I talk about OpenAPI, and it's the idea that if you kind of have OpenAPI at the center of your API universe, you get a lot of benefits from that, from sort of the open source tooling or even paid tooling that allows me to sort of use OpenAPI to be at the center of how I design things, for mocking, for actually implementing the API with like code generation and creating stubs. Documentation is obviously a very popular use case. So you get the idea. I won't go through them all. Where do you see the sort of the end? What does the Wheel of Fortune of Arazzo look like? Like, is it all of the same things? Do you think people are using this to design? I mean, let's run through them. To design their APIs?
Um, yeah, I think it is all, or at least I could talk to topics on all of these. What I would say is that it's at a higher level of abstraction.
Yeah.
And so you're thinking more about, okay, what's the value or the capability that we're exposing towards the consumer, and you're kind of thinking about that problem first, and then how you break that up or how you divide and conquer those different discrete steps. That might be the responsibility of different teams. So there'll be some challenges around, team topologies and who takes ownership for these documents. But ultimately, I think it's a good um, indicator for organizations to kind of maybe think about how they're bringing digital capabilities to market. Because if you have five teams responsible for five APIs, but ultimately your um, business partner is consuming all of these as part of a workflow, but no one is taking responsibility for the end-to-end workflow, you're going to have some pain in that process, and there's going to be manual work that the teams are grinding away on that's actually preventing them from focusing on building new stuff and improving the actual code quality, etc., because they're in support mode. And that happens, and I've seen it happen lots of times, especially if you become somewhat successful and you actually happen to get lots of adopters of your APIs, then you spend much more time than you had anticipated actually supporting them.
Mm,
So this is aimed at really helping the self-service model. So you have a deterministic way to validate lots of the different steps that you showed in the Wheel of Fortune there. And even if underlying APIs change, you can still determine, is this overarching promise still working? Because up
mm,
until now, we don't have a really good way of doing that. You're really relying on, have we got functional tests that are covering this thing? And
mm.
there isn't really any way to serialize those back into the API kind of taxonomy, and to determine, is the overarching promise still working? But Arazzo gives you this human palatable but also machine palatable mechanism to ensure that those promises are being kept.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. Okay. That. Awesome. Awesome. So, last couple of questions. This thing, looking at the specification now, it looks like this is the final first version. It's not like an RFC or something. Like, this is published. It's ready. This is V1.0.0.
This is V1.0.0, yes, formally published on May 29th. We are hoping to add, in a non-breaking way, support for async API documents as well later
Cool.
this year, because that's, again, a very um, practical situation where not all workflows are going to be request response all the way down. You're going to have some asynchronous behavior therein. But we're confident we can do that in a non-breaking way. But we still think there's enough problems and opportunities out there in the world of OpenAPI where Arazzo can still really, really add lots of value to different stakeholders as we stand today.
Awesome. And then finally, who do you think should be looking at this? Like, who's your ultimate target audience at this stage, do you think?
To be honest, I don't have an ultimate target audience. I've talked to lots of different personas over the last 12 months, be it architects, be it developers, be it product managers, be it technical writers, be it testers, be it security folks, observability and DevOps. And they all are identifying use cases and problems where they would see this really, really helping.
Mm,
That can be a blessing and a curse at the same time, because it maybe causes implementers to not have a clear focus on a specific use case. But hopefully, vendors will know where they sit and know what they're good at, and really be able to offer capabilities that are targeting their, let's say, ideal customer profile.
awesome. Makes sense, actually. And I think OpenAPI is like a very broadly applicable, piece of software that's, familiar. The PMs are familiar to it, whether they're using tools over that or the direct schema or architects, or, it's like one of those. The specification is very horizontal. It seems like anyone who works in the API space should be paying attention to this. That'd be like
Yeah,
that's
true.
something.
And like I do like it myself as well, with regards to tackling one of the big problems we have when we're building APIs, and that's kind of the requirements phase around what are we actually going to do. And I
Mm,
think there's even some synergies with behavioral driven development techniques,
mm,
because ultimately when you think about an API, or you think about um, a workflow of APIs together, that's an interface to some behavior. It's not tied to the actual implementation itself. This is the behavior that we want to express towards the consumers. So if you think about how you would describe that in natural human language, as a team finding out what you're actually going to build and what problem you're going to solve, then it's kind of, I think, more intuitive to describe, hey, we want to be able to um, solve the problem of, as the example I showed, adopting a pet matching specific criteria.
hmm
So you negate the risk of going straight into the real nitty gritty details of how every API operation needs to behave, and you first understand what's the capability that we want to expose.
mm,
And there can be even the inverse kind of creation scenario, where you will be starting with, this is the use case or the workflow that we want to solve. You will describe that in natural language. That will get parsed into an Arazzo document. You will have other tooling that will then parse that and determine, based on your rules, how many discrete OpenAPI files you need. So it might completely inverse the apple cart with regards to how we start crafting and designing and implementing our APIs.
awesome. Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Very exciting. Frank, anything you want to add before we close out? Anything we didn't cover that you wanna drop for the audience?
I think we're going to share some links.
Yep.
So everyone, please get engaged with the specification. As I said, it's as early as it can be with getting engaged for a specification. So jump on the bandwagon, start the repo. Let us know what use cases you have. I'm really interested, Josh, in your perspective, use cases from an API management point of view as well. I'll leave it up to you if you want to brainstorm some of those here, or we'll have another conversation on
Yeah, I
that.
probably
But
need some time to think about it. I mean, it does clearly we have like documentation built into Zuplo. Like, how can that play? Folks talk to us about sandbox environments, and one of the problems with sandboxing is it's very easy for us to do mock APIs. But the reality is, like a bunch of mock APIs, which we support today, you can mock an API, just drop in the OpenAPI spec into Zuplo, turn on mocking, and we'll send the examples. But the problem with that simplistic, again, like discrete operation approach is there's no workflow. And that's not really what a sandbox should do. So if you look at like a good sandbox, like what Stripe have with their test environment, I create a transaction and it really allows me to play with the workflow as though it's really doing something. And so something like this feels like it's taking us towards a place where that can be described much more declaratively and might be more something we could generate, right, for people
Mhm.
as an experience in Zuplo, so we can give you the full sandbox experience. So those are a couple of things that seem obvious. Testing seems like a very clear use case here. Like if you have an Arazzo spec and you have examples, it's like, can we just automate a bunch of tests that like do the full workflow and not the discrete items? So I can imagine a lot of things Yeah, I'm kind of excited to see how it bubbles up, and again, excited to see the discussion and what people using this in the wild, and where they're getting the most value. I think that's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that was one of the ways that we made sure that we could get live and stopped bike shedding is we have covered enough scope here. Let's get the specification out. We have relative comfort with the capabilities of it, and
Yeah.
then let's see really what happens when people are implementing it and using it, and then that will drive the future roadmap.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the best way to ship, right, is ship quickly, get some feedback, and then ship again. Frank, it's always awesome hanging out. Thanks so much for coming on today and telling us about this new spec. Thanks very much for like leaning into the work. Like the community appreciates everything you do, both for OpenAPI this and everything else when you go and do your talks around the conference circuit where I usually bump into you. Thanks very much, and yeah, we'll see you on here again soon, hopefully.
Yeah, thanks very much, Josh.